What's up, everybody? Welcome to another IG Live. I am Hector Luis Alamo, Senior Editor here at Latino Rebels. Today, another special guest, one of my favorite people. The work that they do is one of my favorite things. I'll be joined by Jordana Timerman. Hope I'm saying her first name right. She is the editor of the Latin America Daily Briefing, which I've been following for, I feel like it feels like 10 years. I mean, I don't know when she founded it, but it feels like 10 years. It is, for my money, the best way to stay up going on. But let's bring her on. Let's see, does that work? Hey,
Hi.
what's
How's it
up?
going? Having
Good, how are
slight
you?
technical difficulties, but
Yeah,
I think we've solved it. Thank you so much for your kind intro.
I mean, am I lying? On my own podcast, right? I've been following. When did you found Latin America Daily Brief? When did it start?
Actually, I've been doing it for about 8 years, but it precedes me. It's been ongoing. It's a space that has been
Okay.
financed by Open Society Foundation, and its goal is to track all of the goings on in Latin America, but largely focused on human rights. Are we breaking up? I think we're having a little bit of trouble here.
We thought this might happen because you said the connection in Latin America is a bit sketchy. You're in Argentina, correct? Oof. Yeah, we thought this might happen. 8 years. I mean that means Jordana's the only founder that I've known that I've been following Daily Briefing. You've been the editor the whole time. So that's how long I've been a reader.
Well, I'm glad to hear it. The goal is always to make sure that readers can be informed of really everything that's going on, but always with a focus on politics, human rights in particular. So I'm glad to hear that you're a fan.
And I've been wanting to bring somebody on to talk about Latin America, and so who better? Country we have to discuss, I think, you tell me, is Guatemala, Ecuador, Argentina. They, just election in Guatemala this Sunday, snap election in Ecuador on Sunday as well, and then a primary. You'll explain how that worked. A primary on Sunday as well, where a kind of Bolsonaro kind of character came out ahead and sent the already fragile and struggling Argentine economy sinking even lower, right?
Well, it's it's a lot. Well, if you want, we can start with Guatemala, which is a rare, hopeful piece of news. So that's always a good thing. The anti-corruption candidate Bernardo Arevalo won in Sunday's election in Guatemala. It was a landslide victory over Sandra Torres in a runoff election. Perhaps the unexpected thing is not so much that he won, but that he was allowed to run and win at all, because we're talking about a country where the judiciary and entrenched corruption, always at the service of various elite political parties, have sought to make sure that nobody who could end the status quo would even be allowed anywhere near the ballot. So Arevalo is a surprise win in that sense, and a hopeful one because it shows that Guatemalans are together behind some form of change and behind rejecting a status quo that is so entrenched. It's known as the Pact of the Corrupt, and it goes beyond any given president and is a sort of informal coalition of all the judiciary and political parties that have gathered to make sure that their kleptocracy remains untouched. So this is really a very big victory I don't think we can say it's all over yet. Be prepared to see legal challenges to Arevalo's victory, legal challenges to his Movimiento Semilla anti-corruption party, and who knows what other guises the attacks might take ahead of his taking office in January. And even if he is allowed to take office, the judiciary is seeking ways to undermine his political party and could affect his ability to govern through the National Assembly. So it's a very big victory for the anti-corruption movement in Guatemala, but it's not over yet.
Breaking up. But he won by a huge margin, right? He won by like 20%.
He won by over 60% compared to 30 something for Sandra Torres, I believe. I don't have the numbers in front of me. It was a runoff election, so there were only two candidates in this round. The first round was on June 25th. Arevalo was actually the second place vote getter that time. Sandra Torres came in first with, I think, 22%, a very low number. Arevalo was low as well. There was a very wide playing field and a lot of voter dissatisfaction because at least three of the favorite candidates from the right and the left, but all promising some level of change, were kept off the ballot by judicial decisions. So, I mean, I think that's a sign. Bernardo Arevalo was really a surprise second place and a surprise change after several more well-known candidates off the ballot.
No, it's breaking up, but I still wanted to. I learned was that he is the son of the Arevalo from the 40s, who was the predecessor of his name escapes me, but anybody who's read A Bitter Fruit knows the story of
exactly,
Guatemala. So it's kind
of Jacobo Arbenz was. So Bernardo Arevalo's father was the first democratic president of Guatemala, and the predecessor of Jacobo Arbenz, who effectively is the one president overthrown in bitter, the first.
And Guatemala is still contending with that. I was saying that Guatemala is still contending with the legacy of that coup, which is kind of what is the historic irony here, is that here you have a candidate who is contending with what happened. Did you?
I'm sorry, I need you to repeat that last part.
Yeah.
No,
the historic irony is that here's a candidate who is like the legacy of that regime and what could have been Guatemala, right? Contending with the legacy of the coup, right? Because it's been kind of trouble in Guatemala since the coup.
And I think that's an interesting point. I mean, maybe normally we wouldn't necessarily celebrate a political dynasty of sorts, but this really isn't that. Bernardo Arevalo doesn't have a political career. In fact, he was born in Uruguay. His father was something that Sandra Torres sought to capitalize on in this past election. She tried to, portray him as not fallen when really children of of Latin American countries. So I always feel the story of a child of exile is obviously not that of a foreigner parachuting in.
Right.
And I think it has been a message of change. It's really resonated. Arevalo's father was sort of the author of the first Guatemalan spring, and so it really lends itself neatly to a narrative of another spring. And Movimiento Semilla, which Arevalo represents, was born of the 2015 anti-corruption protests, which ultimately ousted Otto Pérez Molina in the midst of La Línea scandal and his vice president. And that was a moment of profound hope, and that's when Movimiento Semilla was born. And the name, of course, speaks to that, sort of the seed of what may come. And Guatemala was followed by several years of very intense democratic backsliding, which was really a slap in the face to the hopes of that anti-corruption movement. And many of the protagonists of that movement suffered significant attacks and were forced into exile themselves. So this isn't only about Guatemala's older history, but also about the recent history. Arevalo has promised to work with prosecutors and judges who have been forced into exile for their anti-corruption work. So it's really a revindication of efforts to bring about a Guatemalan spring much closer to the present day.
And that's how corrupt things are in Guatemala, is that, you know, there was hope, you know, with the anti-corruption body there in Guatemala. And what ends up happening is that the establishment goes after the corruption squad and says, basically, no, we're going to keep our corruption.
It's really mind-boggling. It's not only, you know, we're going to keep our corruption, but also we're going to jail you and threaten you and force you into exile. There are dozens of former anti-corruption prosecutors and judges who have been forced to leave the country. And one of the most prominent journalists in Guatemala, Zamora, is actually in jail now, and his newspaper was forced to shut down. I think that's really a sign of how bad it is, and what Arevalo is fighting against, which isn't just one force, but a really entrenched, corrupt system, which is more of a hydra. It's harder to battle with any given policy.
And as you mentioned earlier, that the establishment is still, I mean, he's won, but there are still attempts to say that his party isn't legitimate, that there was irregularities in the vote counting in the June election. So Go ahead.
There were accusations of irregularities in the June vote counting, and it's important to note that these elections were monitored by the OAS, which detected no irregularities, and by the European Union, which also detected no irregularities. This wasn't just happening in a void. The current judicial onslaught that Arevalo's Movimiento Semilla is facing is accusations of irregularities in the signatures obtained to make it a party. So they're trying to argue that there was fraud committed in obtaining the support needed to create a party. So it could happen that Arevalo is sworn in, his presidency is upheld, but his party is declared illegal. And it's unclear what would happen to the 23 lawmakers, which are a minority that the Movimiento Semilla managed to get elected. So there's a lot of potential outcomes here. Not all are, you know, the arrest of Arevalo. There's a lot of other ways that his presidency could be undermined.
And to his credit, President Giammattei was magnanimous, saying, you know, it's time for a peaceful transfer of power, or how did that go?
I mean, he hasn't been known for being magnanimous or democratic at all, so I think it's probably a sign of just the overwhelming landslide that Arevalo won by more than anything else. But there was also a lot of pressure from the United States that was reported on before, a lot of diplomatic pressure urging Giammattei to respect the democratic will. So I think that probably had an effect as well.
And any final words before we move to Ecuador?
I mean, it's rare that we get such a nice piece of good news from Central America. So let's savor it and hope that it maintains.
Yeah. So with that, we move to a less hopeful scenario in Ecuador, where they're dealing with political violence, where it's not actually part of their history. 3 assassinations in recent months. One like 2 weeks ago of a presidential candidate leaving a rally in Quito. It's so not a part of their culture. I was reading from your lovely daily briefing that they don't even know how to. There's no process for protecting a presidential candidate other than maybe a police officer or some, you know. And then somebody was shot at on Sunday or over the weekend too.
Well, there were. Let's take it by bits. So Ecuador has been one of the safest countries in the region, or it has had a low homicide rate. And so as tends to happen when there's a sudden increase in violence, the difference is felt very acutely. But they actually have a very high homicide rate in recent years. And it's been attributed to the rise of transnational gangs and Ecuador's new space as a hub for cocaine trafficking to the US. Remember, it's right by Colombia. And so all of this has contributed to a sudden rise in violence, and the government hasn't been able to really respond in any effective way. There's been many states of emergency, both in the most violent cities like Guayaquil and also within prisons. There has been a lot of violence within prisons. And all of this really spilled over onto the national stage with the assassination of Fernando Villavicencio 2 weeks ago, exiting a campaign rally. I mean, all of it is caught on video. The police protection was ineffective. He had been threatened by a gang leader, by a criminal leader who's in jail. So it was really very horrific, very violent, very shocking. And so security, which was already very much on the radar and a prime concern, became the topic for the Ecuadorian election. And you were saying how unprepared they are to protect candidates. The vote was carried out this Sunday under a state of emergency, and ballot boxes were protected by police and military that were all deployed to protect sort of polling stations around the country. You can see the videos of how the candidates themselves voted. They were wearing bulletproof vests and helmets and were protected by sort of machine gun toting members of the military, and these bizarre sort of bulletproof shields that were being held up by 2 police officers. I mean, the scene is ludicrous. It looks very, very improvised and very, very strange to see. But we have a lot of admiration that they carried out the elections in this scenario and that people were brave enough to go vote, because it's not just politicians who are threatened, but people who were worried about being robbed on the way to vote or facing other situations of violence. The episode of violence against Daniel Noboa, who was actually the second place winner on Sunday, is sort of a murky episode. He says he was attacked, or his caravan was near a place where there was gunfire. The police say that he was just near a shootout of some sort. Noboa says he was somehow targeted, or at least close. Regardless, the point is there was gunfire, there's a situation of insecurity, and after Villavicencio's assassination, there was really a lot of fear about holding campaign events, not just because of the candidates, but also because of people attending them.
And again, Villavicencio was a anti-corruption journalist. Part of his work was the reason that Correa was, judged to get convicted in absentia. But his protege, Luisa Gonzalez, won first place. And she says if she becomes president, to make him an advisor. And also the referendum to stop drilling in Yasuni rainforest. So that seems to bode as if a signal that there's a hunger or desire to return to Correísmo in Ecuador, no?
I think there's a polarization. Luisa Gonzalez got about 33% and Daniel Noboa got 24%, but it seems likely that he might win a runoff election, which will be held on October 15th, because the other candidates, it seems likely that the voters for the other candidates who are of the right would gather behind Daniel Noboa, who's sort of the latest outsider millennial to appear on the scene. But he comes from a business family. He's the son of a banana empire tycoon. He's actually a U.S. citizen, was raised in the U.S. And it seems like the market seemed pretty excited that he could win. He's sort of talk about being anti-correísta, of creating jobs, of refreshing Ecuador's economy. And besides security, economy is the second largest concern of Ecuadorian voters. So it seems likely that Luisa Gonzalez might lose the runoff election. But Correísmo is definitely sort of the polarizing trend. It's Correísmo or anti-Correísmo at this time.
And speaking of, somebody's asking, make whom an advisor? I said Rafael Correa. I mean, how would you describe what Rafael Correa is to Ecuador in present day politics?
I mean, Rafael Correa is a very big influence. He's a former president who was judged in absentia on corruption charges. Most people who favor him are not very convinced, and he governed over a period of large reduction of poverty, very large reduction of poverty, in part because of the commodities boom, but nonetheless, there were a lot of social programs, a lot of work taken. And in fact, I was seeing today, there's an interesting report by Insight Crime looking at how insecurity was reduced under Correa, and in part because of a very controversial program that seems to have worked of gang legalization, of working with street gangs to create instead of targeting them for mano dura, to legalize them. And it appears, according to the experts cited in Insight Crime, that this is one of the reasons Ecuador came into these years with such a low homicide rate in the first place. So I think, like many of the leaders of the pink tide, there's a lot of polarization. There's a lot of people who will remember the benefits, the real tangible benefits brought under him, whereas others will point to allegations of corruption or potential mismanagement of sorts. All the pink tide governments have a very controversial legacy in their country. People tend to be either heavily for or against. I think it's similar.
What do you think about that? It's called in other places the truce with drug gangs. We've seen it in, I believe, El Salvador and other places. It seems to work basically because the gangs are so in control, operate with such an impunity that they say, we won't be so violent if you lay off of us. And it seems to lower the violence. What is your take on that?
I don't have, I'm not an expert in Ecuador's. In El Salvador, it seemed to be really the thing that worked the most in reducing violence up until now. Although now we always have to take it with a grain of salt because we don't actually know what is going on in El Salvador with homicides now. And I think that's an important thing, as we all talk about sort of the success of the Bukele method. While it's undeniably safer, we also don't know exactly what's going on there. So while we know from the streets and from reporting that people feel safer, that there's a huge reduction in gang presence, there's also other parts that we don't know of what's going on. I think going back to Correa's lasting influence on Ecuador, it's not always directly lineal that someone's protege will then be a protector of them. Lenin Moreno was also a former Ecuadorian president, was also Correa's protege, and he then really broke with Correísmo and went against Rafael Correa. So I don't think it's quite so lineal. She does come from his space and has campaigned heavily on his legacy, though.
And her platform is what? She wants to root out corruption. She wants to clean up the police squads, right? She wants to secure the borders with Peru and Colombia. What is her platform?
She also wants to bring back social programs. Remember, Ecuador is in the midst of austerity measures and is having financing difficulties with the IMF. So really sort of a very classic debate that we're used to seeing.
And this person who wins, it's either going to be a first woman president or the youngest president Ecuador's ever had. And they're only going to rule for 18 months, right?
My correction is it would be the first elected female president. I was the one who put it would be the first president. There was for 2 days a female president like 30 years ago. And this would be the first elected female president. And yes, it's going to be a short term. Ecuador is having had snap elections this Sunday, after President Guillermo Lasso declared sudden death, which is a constitutional clause where he can dissolve Congress and rule by decree for 6 months and call general elections. So he did this ahead of a probable impeachment in May. And then he did not run. He could have run. He decided not to run. His political movement did not field a candidate. And since then, he's been largely declaring states of emergency for the insecurity situation and hoping to get pro-business decrees to stick in Ecuador.
It
He
sounds
seems to
pretty
think that.
bleak. I mean, it sounds pretty bleak. Like they're trying to impeach the president. He called sudden death, 100,000 police officers and army soldiers to, secure an election. It sounds pretty bleak.
It does seem pretty bleak, actually, I have to say. It's not looking hopeful. 18 months is not a long time to govern, and analysts are saying really the next president, whoever it is going to spend most of their time campaigning for almost immediate reelection. Um, so it's not looking very promising right now, but hopefully it will be.
Any final words on Ecuador? Let's move on to Argentina. Now, I mean, this is part of a trend that we're seeing not only in Latin America but worldwide. Of we'll describe this candidate here in Argentina.
Well, libertarian Javier Milei, I think he's more of an alt-right. He's a very confusing candidate. I mean, he's been described as a Trump, as a Bolsonaro. He is that, in that he's an angry outsider who denounces the political caste and wants to get rid of everybody. In that sense, you know, he's really capitalizing on a lot of anger in the midst of yet another protracted economic crisis. Half of the country is living in poverty. We have triple-digit interannual inflation, which is why I always laugh when someone from the US talks to me about 7% inflation. That's what I had last week. So all of that makes a lot of sense, but Milei is sort of an extreme libertarian. He keeps promising to get rid of the central bank. He wants to dollarize the economy, which in practical terms would be a very drastic and severe devaluation of the peso, which really would decimate the income of most people in Argentina. But he's also allied himself with some very far-right characters who want to get rid of abortion, which is obviously not a very libertarian stance at all. So he has a lot of hypocrisies in his campaign platform, in which he said there's no reason we shouldn't have a human organ market. There should be a market for human organs. Adoption similarly could be monetized according to him, but he would also roll back Argentina's abortion legality. So not necessarily.
And deregulate the gun market. He wants to make guns more accessible.
He wants to make guns more accessible. Right now, there was a very horrific episode of insecurity. An 11-year-old girl was killed in a drive-by robbery just before the election 10 days ago. And that was really sort of had a huge impact. So his stuff on crime discourse has really resonated. Although the entire country went to the right, he obtained 30% in the primaries, which, as you were saying, if I could explain them, they're very confusing. They're open and simultaneous primaries, which means anybody can vote in any party's primary, but you can only vote in one space, and they're obligatory. So in theory, everybody votes, and they're somewhat of sort of a massive national poll ahead of the October elections, with a very strong effect. You know, whoever wins these primaries is seen as winning the election, or certainly the person to contend with. And in that sense, Milei got 30%. He was closely followed by Patricia Bullrich. The Juntos por el Cambio conservative coalition obtained 29%, a few percentage points behind, and closely followed by the candidate of the Unión por la Patria, which is the governing coalition. So really, we're talking about a third scenario. It's not that Milei won by a landslide or anything like that, but he did obtain about 10 points more than polling had predicted, which was why it was such a shocking upset. The voters for all these candidates seem to be fairly firmly entrenched, so it's not clear that any given candidate can poach the other ones, although there's some interchangeability between Milei and Patricia Wolf, coalition's candidate.
And what I mean, what's the theory behind doing that primary before the election? What is the
No, the theory was to democratize parties. It was an electoral reform law, which It has a sound basis, which is to help parties select their candidates democratically. The problem is, and this election really seems to have proven it, most parties haven't fielded a competitive slate. Juntos por el Cambio is the exception. They did field competitive candidates, and it seems that voters had punished them for it. They were turned off by a really bloody primary campaign between the two candidates. So I think, if anything, the results of Sunday are really going to be dissuasive for parties going forward in hoping to democratically determine candidates. And that's really a shame. Perhaps the law could have been better written or better constructed to encourage actual competition within parties instead of sort of this big primary opinion poll.
I challenge anybody to Google Milei and not tell me that he does not look like a action movie villain. I mean, he looks like
he says he hasn't combed his hair since he was 13 or something like that. And honestly, I believe it. He does have an amazing head of hair for a 53-year-old.
Yeah, he looks but he looks like he should be, playing opposite Liam Neeson in something, like
as a villain, I would like to think.
Oh, of course. And what is the situation? What's behind the economic crisis in Argentina? Because, you guys were here 20 years ago, right?
And I think that's part of sort of the shell shock that people feel, because this does very much feel like 2001 again. If anything, we're all 20 years older, we're all 20 years more tired. And there was the feeling that this last political cycle, these past 20 years, should have resolved this, and they haven't. I was reading an interesting theory by journalist Carlos Pani, who says basically the 2001 crisis was never really resolved. It was just suspended. The political parties found a way to administer the chaos, to lessen the social pain through social programs and social spending, which really put off the unrest. But the underlying economic imbalances haven't really been addressed. And I think that's part of what we're seeing right now. Argentina tends to oscillate between import substitution models that have better quality of life for more people, but are apparently somewhat unsustainable in time. And then neoliberal export models, which are beneficial for more of an elite, and which some people say should have a spillover effect, but also, cause a lot of pain in a lot of the population and are politically unsustainable. And there's a lot of oscillation between these two models. There's a lot of anger that nothing seems to have worked. Argentina has had 12 years of a Kirchner government, followed by 4 years of the ultra-conservative Macri government, and then back to a Peronist model. And I think voters say, we've given both sides a try in recent years. It only gets worse. And I think that's a large part of why Milei is having this sudden boom. Economists say his theories won't work, that the policies are impractical, but people have tried both of the main political offerings, and there's nothing really new. Nobody is saying anything new. Nobody has promised anything new on tackling inflation. And so Milei's very strong conviction that his theories would work have appeal to people who are very...
And that is the appeal of those kind of candidates, like a Trump in the United States. Let's put aside any racism, white supremacy. There's definitely that, but there's also, and I know people like that who are sick of the two-party rule, or sick of the Republicans, sick of the Democrats, and they say, well, let's take a risk on this candidate, right?
And I think that's the interesting thing that we need to be paying attention to with Milei, and that's what most analysts here are focusing on. There's definitely, as you say, like a white supremacy issue. There's racism. There's a lot of things going on, especially around Milei. He has associated himself with a lot of very strange alt-right characters that are possibly more socially conservative and extreme than he is on those fronts. But his libertarian economic message is really resonating, even among people who might arguably be very hurt by it. And what we're seeing is that poverty alleviation measures aren't alleviating enough poverty, and that's pushing a lot of the country's poorest people to support Milei. And I think that's definitely something to be paid attention to by the mainstream parties, and any coalition that hopes to sort of gather against Milei in an anti-fascist coalition or a Macron effect has to take that into account. That's a very valid issue that people are expressing right now.
No, I agree. I mean, I don't, yeah, I don't discount the sentiment behind the support for those candidates.
Unfortunately, it seems unlikely that he's going to actually solve anything for those people. And so I think that's sort of the other painful thing, is how to counter it with better proposals. And unfortunately, I'm not seeing a lot of that on the campaign scene right now.
Well, a lot of people vote nowadays not on facts or information. They vote on emotion, right? They vote on hope or fear or whatever, right? Any final words on Argentina?
Stay tuned.
Good, that's good. I wanted to ask you, I said it would be half an hour, but I wanted to ask you, there's plenty to talk about. You let me know if there's anything you want to talk about that we didn't talk about. I wanted to get quickly your thoughts on Lula's, first months in office. And how long has it been now? It's been
a little over 6 months, 8 months, because he assumed on January 1st. Well, there's a lot of hopeful fronts, and I do like to emphasize the positive. He's been doing a lot on the green transition, particularly rainforest protection, a lot of operatives to eradicate illegal mining. I mean, a lot of strong advances in areas that were very abandoned by Bolsonaro, in protection of indigenous territories and of indigenous people, a lot of discourse on incorporating Black concerns, indigenous concerns. And I mean, that's a lot of hope in a country where Bolsonaro had gone very far against these people, where violence against indigenous people and Black people was very much on the rise, thanks to the presidential discourse. So I think we can't underestimate the strength of Lula's sort of government. He's been very strong, and that's very welcome. He's faced opposition on his green policies from Congress, and he's sought to push them through anyway. So I think it's very good that he's taken a strong stance on that. He's seeking international financing. He's seeking to link up with other Amazon countries. So he's really taking a very strong stance on the rainforest. And I think that's very welcome in a time when there's almost no good news on climate. It feels good to see somebody doing something, and that it's Lula who's somewhat of a superhero. If Lula wants to do something, he'll get it done, is the perception. So that's a very, very welcome front. His other track records, he's been doing well on the economy. So people are very optimistic about that. His international track record is getting a little bit muddled. He is trying to chart out a third way. He's trying to avoid depending on China or on the United States. The message, which I think is fairly clear, which is, attempting to find a third way between them and not depend on either superpower, has been really ill taken in the United States, which sort of doesn't seem to understand, you're not with us, you're against us. Right. Particularly with Ukraine, and his overtures at peacemaking haven't really flown very well. I mean, I think he was trying to avoid too strong a criticism of Russia, which makes sense if you're seeking to be a mediator, but it was really poorly taken in Ukraine, and a lot of his comments maybe should have been better calibrated with that in mind. So maybe a few diplomatic missteps, but he is trying to chart a very interesting course. And right now with the BRICS summit in South Africa, I think we'll see a little bit how it's working. It's a very tricky position that he's trying to outline. And if anyone can do it, it's him. So I think it's an interesting thing to watch and maybe avoid these sort of reflexive, is he against the US? Is he pro-China? Is he pro-Russia? I think he's really just trying to chart his own path, and I think that's something that's worthwhile for Brazil to do.
No, and all those other countries that want to join him, it's a new global politics that maybe it makes Americans uncomfortable because we're so used to being at the top. But I think he's trying to do right by Brazil, which is what a leader should do for their country.
I think so, and I think that right by Brazil is also right by a lot of the global South. If we look at what it means for a country like Brazil to chart its own diplomatic path and its own stance. And he's shown a lot of solidarity with Latin American countries, with his peers in progressive countries around him. And I think that's also important. He's gotten a lot of flack, but I think there's a lot to congratulate.
I mean, speaking of progressive peers, what do you think of Petro in Colombia?
He's in a rough situation right now. He has a lot of scandals that are hitting very close to home. His son was arrested for illicit campaign financing, taking money from criminal organizations, drug dealers, apparently in part for the campaign and in part to finance his own lavish lifestyle, as they've been reporting. To be fair, Petro has also been hit hard in Congress. His attempts at reform have really been blocked. So he's having a difficult situation. He has an interesting green discourse. He's trying to do interesting things on protecting the environment, particularly opposing oil. But he's having a rough time in terms of governance.
Oh. Well, I wanted to end by asking you something that it just came. I was talking to somebody and it just came up, and I've been following it somewhat closely. What do you think about the possibility of what are they calling it, international intervention force in Haiti?
There's a lot of experts that say some sort of international assistance needs to happen. The United Nations in particular has been strong on that. Antonio Gutierrez outlined it last week. If it's not an international peacekeeping mission, some sort of support for the police needs to happen. I think there's a lot of wariness from civil society that such a force would essentially prop up interim Prime Minister Ariel Henry's government. He's been interim prime minister for 2 years now. It's not even clear that he was the legitimate leader for Haiti, and he hasn't made any moves to calling elections. So I think there's a lot of concern that stabilization in Haiti would be stabilization of his government, which isn't well seen in civil society. There's also a lot of concern of potential human rights violations caused by attempts to stabilize. You have to remember this extremely negative history of stabilization attempts in Haiti, including the UN peacekeeping and efforts to help the country after the earthquake in 2010. So Haiti is between a rock and a hard place. They need some form of international help, but it needs to be very carefully put together to avoid making the problem worse. And in a Miami Herald article today, they were reporting on a new surge of gang violence, that one of the underlying factors could be the potential international intervention to support police. So I think it's one of those cases where every variable seems to have a lot of negative knock-on effects that need to be very carefully taken into account. And it's a place where it's essentially a failed state at this point, where people are scared to leave their houses in huge chunks of the country. So while there needs to be international aid, it's very difficult to see how it won't make the situation worse. And I think that's a lot of the fear in Haiti right now.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking to see what's been happening in Haiti. It feels like forever. A lot of it due to international intervention. So I get it's under the residence is understandable. But I guess I'd be remiss if I don't ask you about Mexico and don't ask you about Chile. Which one do you want to take?
Well, I need to start closing this up. We'll take Chile, which Boric is being hit by his own scandals with the disbursement of funds to civil society organizations, NGOs that have been linked to members of his government. But he's taken a very strong stance against it. Several of his closest aides have resigned in an attempt to help his government. He's promised really to crack down on any form of corruption, no matter who's carried it out. And he's very determined to move forward, even as Congress has blocked some of his most important reforms. And the Constitution was rejected by voters a year ago, and now the new constitutional effort is being run by a right-wing party. So Boric is really struggling, but is also working very hard to move forward and maintain a progressive agenda. I think it's interesting to watch his efforts.
And Mexico is getting ready for a presidential election. I mean, what do you think of AMLO's term in office?
It's been pretty bad. Um, Unfortunately, I think I was one of the people who saw with hope that
Yeah,
he
me too.
finally acceded to office after many valiant attempts. And he has a lot of interesting discourses that I thought were worth emphasizing, and a very interesting grassroots history. He was sort of portraying himself as a man of the people, a sort of Jose Mujica of Mexico, and that really hasn't panned out at all. He spent a lot of his time in office attacking feminist groups, women's rights organizations, journalists. And remember, when you attack journalists in Mexico, that it's one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a reporter. So that makes really his attacks far worse than they would be in another country. He's really just spent a lot of time attacking other groups and not, and to boot, he's implemented austerity measures. He hasn't done a lot of public spending. And instead of demilitarizing his famous hugs, not bullets, he's really militarized
Yeah.
vast portions of the country that you wouldn't even have thought should be militarized, like vaccine distribution, airport, that he wants to do a military airline. So really, he's gone in an unexpected direction. Nonetheless, he's vastly popular. His candidate has a very strong, whoever his candidate is, has a very strong chance of winning the next election.
But it
So
looks to be the mayor of Mexico City, right?
it looks like it, but they're going to decide by polls, a poll by each of the three main candidates and one by the Morena party. It's very, speaking of primary systems, that's a very novel one, especially because polling, you can get a poll to say whatever you want, so it's not very clear which way this is going to go.
Well, I want to thank you so much. I don't know why I thought I would be able to hold you to three countries when we're talking about Latin America. And I'm
It's a
talking to
lot
the
of
editor.
fun. Thank you for having me.
Let everybody know where they can find the daily briefing.
It's on a Substack. It's in my the link is in my profile. So it's Latin America Daily Briefing on Substack. You can subscribe there and get a daily main article and briefs on all that's happening from Mexico to Argentina. And
Like I said,
I'd love.
it's the easiest way to stay up to date on Latin America. Just subscribe to the newsletter. It comes in your inbox every morning. I drink it. I drink it with my coffee. I drink it with my coffee. And I cannot praise the work you do so enough. Keep it up. I'm a huge fan. Final words?
Thank you.
At all?
I got nothing. Thank you so much, and I'll see you soon. Let's do this again.
Thank you.
Bye.
Cheers.